my name's Paul Atkins. I'd like to talk to you about the Prosocial initiative. Prosocial is a process designed to help groups of all sizes and shapes cooperate more effectively, get along with one another. And it's being applied particularly in the context of schools, which is the work I'd like to share with you today. Prosocial, there is the book that we've written about it. It's an approach that is a perspective, it is a practical process, it's a research effort and a community. I'm going to talk to you about each of those things today. As a perspective, it's based on three main ideas: evolutionary theory, Lynn Ostrom's work on the commons, and an approach called contextual behavioural science for changing human behaviour. In terms of evolutionary theory, our first lineage, we are interested in the practical implications of what's called multi-level selection theory. Evolution is reliant upon three main processes: variation, selection, and retention. So most of us are familiar with genetics evolution. There's variation in the genes, selection according to what works best in the context that the organism is in, and retention through the transmission of genetic transmission of genes. But actually, evolution is not just limited to genetics. It's also occurring in our immune system. It's occurring in epigenetic processes where different genes are switched on and off in response to life experiences. But it's also, importantly, occurring in our behaviour. So we do things that are rewarding more frequently, and we do things that are punishing less frequently. We're constantly evolving our behaviour. As I speak to you, I'm trying out things that work and don't work for this recording and doing the things that work more frequently. Evolution is occurring in multiple streams, but it's also occurring at multiple levels, and this is really important from our point of view. Within each individual, there's evolution going on in terms of behaviour, in terms of genetics and epigenetics, as I've mentioned. But also at the level of groups and groups of groups, our cultures are continuously evolving. And our key idea in Prosocial is that we need to get better at noticing how evolution occurs and use that knowledge from evolution to help guide our cultural evolution to be more conscious, to consciously evolve. A key idea in this space is that what's good for one level may not be good for other levels. So the classic example within an individual, cancer, what's good for an individual cancer cell may not be good for the whole organism. What's good for Mark Zuckerberg may not be good for society. And what's good for a particular organisation might not be good for the individuals that work in that organisation. Now, this might seem pretty obvious in some ways, but on the other hand, it's actually a really important point, because for the last 40 or 50 years, we've been stuck in a really dominant economic narrative that has told us that what's good for the individual is necessarily good for the group. Some people call that neoliberalism, free market ideology, the idea of homo economicus, and the invisible hand that invariably, if the individual takes care of themselves, that'll be good for the whole of society. We're seeing now the costs of that dominant worldview, both in terms of our environment and in terms of rising levels of inequity. And we're seeing it particularly in schools, as many of you will have encountered, where economics is not the primary value for what it is that we're trying to do. The second major lineage that's influenced our work in prosocial schools is Eleanor Ostrom's work on the commons. Now, Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work studying groups all around the world and how they managed resources like fisheries and water supplies. And she particularly studied a phenomenon that was labelled at the time the tragedy of the commons. It's basically the idea that if you've got a shared resource, that everyone will just rush in and exploit that resource, take whatever they can, and eventually there'll be nothing left. If you generalize this idea out a little bit, you could talk about a school as a commons, for example, where the shared resource is education and the possibility of education. And you can have people operating out of self-interest in that space, perhaps misbehaving or not working effectively, and essentially extracting from the resource so that it's not as good for everybody else. Now, traditionally, when people think about management of a commons, they think about only two ways of doing it, either top-down regulation and rules or bottom-up markets and ownership. But the commons as a shared space where people agree on a set of social protocols and there's a community that cares and a shared sense of purpose is actually a really good model for effective cooperation. And we're very, very good at it. Humans are evolved to work in small groups and groups of groups effectively. But Lynn Ostrom's work was novel because what it did was it identified 8 core design principles that help groups to function really, really effectively. Shared identity and purpose, equitable distribution of contributions and benefits, fair and inclusive decision-making, so those who are affected by decisions are involved in the making of them, noticing agreed behaviours or transparency so that nobody can act selfishly without others noticing, graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behaviour. This is essentially the idea of providing feedback or others in the group acting in ways to increase the frequency of helpful behaviour and decrease the frequency of unhelpful behaviours. And everyone taking responsibility for that. Fast and fair conflict resolution is obviously key to small group functioning. And then a couple of principles about how the group relates to the outside world. The group needs to have enough authority to be able to implement principles 1 through 6. They need to be able to manage their decision-making and their purpose without excessive interference. Obviously, they're situated in a context, so a class within a school is going to have to operate within school guidelines. But the class teacher needs to have enough freedom to be able to create an environment that embodies those first 6 principles. Similarly, each class needs to get along with other classes in the school, and that's the last principle, collaborations, in collaborative relations with other groups, which is just the idea that these first 7 principles actually work just as well at any scale. So classes need to have shared purpose and identity between them. There needs to be equity between classes or between schools. There needs to be fair and inclusive decision-making between classes, etc. So the principles are really, really effective guides to what needs to be in place at any level or scale. Now, I'm just going to skip over some evidence because we don't have time here, but if you want to, I'll make the slides available to you and you can take a look over some of the extensive evidence for each of those principles. There's actually meta-analyses with tens of thousands of people involved supporting each one of them. One way to understand what Prosocial is trying to do is that we're trying to shift culture from domination cultures to partnering cultures, or power over to power with. That's the work of Ryan Eichler, who wrote a book called Nurturing Our Humanity. The third main lineage for Prosocial is contextual behavioural science, which is an approach to behaviour change from the inside out. One of the key ideas within contextual behavioural science is the idea of psychological flexibility, that we need to have these 6 skills, being able to unhook from our thinking, being able to accept our experience as it is, being able to attend to the present moment, maintaining an observing sense of self, not getting hooked into rigid labels about who I am and who you are, and then being able to clarify values and commit to action. The contextual behavioural science is being widely used in the school context, just as it is, and we're extending it to the cooperation in the prosocial model. Some of the reasons why psychological flexibility is important in groups. Have you ever identified any of these behaviours in a group where you've been a part of? maybe fear-driven desire to control others, or an inability to identify critical values, or generalized mistrust. Well, if you think about it, each one of those is actually going to get in the way of implementing all those core design principles. So if I just click back here, you know, shared identity and purpose. If we're trying to create shared identity and purpose, then if people don't have or aren't able to identify their values or articulate them, or if there's really strong mistrust in the group, then obviously those things are really going to interfere with implementing the core design principles. So we think that this inner work with people, whether it's groups of teachers or groups of students, is just as important as having these pointers to some of the key processes that you need to set up within a group. One of the ways that we do this is through using a tool called the ACT matrix, Acceptance and Commitment Training Matrix. And the nice thing about this tool is it helps people to identify what really matters to them, what they want to do about that, but also what their fears and concerns are, and how sometimes they're being hooked by those fears and concerns and acting in ways that might not be all that helpful. Contextual behavioral science gives you a whole bunch of practical tools that you can use for turning those fears and concerns into energy rather than a destructive force in the school context. As a practical process, we generally have a research and evaluation process built around any intervention that we do. We often work with groups to help them identify their individual interests or values, if you like, concerns within a group. And then we have them work in groups to start to notice overlaps between those individual interests, and also start to build a new sense of themselves as a group with a shared purpose and creating alignment between their individual interests and the collective. The core design principles then work really nicely as a focus for conversation for, okay, how are we going to realize this shared purpose together as a group in a way that creates a power with culture rather than power over. This is the results of a school that I worked with in Sydney, in Australia, with a very large school, K through 12, 143 teachers. And this was the personal matrix where we just had them use a tool called Mentimeter to clarify their values in response to the question, what really matters to you about being part of this school? Some of the things that they felt they could do to embody those values, but also some of the things they were most concerned about and some of the things they actually did when they were hooked by those concerns. So that was a school example. The nice thing about this matrix tool is that you can use it at multiple levels. So you can use it for individuals, but you can also ask what matters most to us to build a collective, a map of our collective interests and concerns. With other tools that we have that we use with groups, like these spoke diagrams where people can identify how well their group's working, maybe their class group or their, and then the whole school, or how their class group relates to other classes. You can use this tool in lots of different ways. But I did want to just share with you a few examples of the breadth of this tool. The last example I will give you, well, actually, let me start with that. The first example I will give you is prosocial schools, which is probably most relevant for this audience in the education stream. I'd invite you to take a look at this website, www.prosocialschools.org, and you'll see all the different ways that we're using prosocial in the educational context. We're using some of the ideas as content for teachers. We develop all sorts of materials like lesson plans and so forth that teachers can use to talk about human cooperation as a cross-disciplinary subject that actually brings together a number of different disciplines. But we also use it to help build cooperation in the classroom and in schools and between schools and their parent communities and broader communities. One of the most exciting initiatives that you'll see on that Prosocial Schools page is a thing called the Youth Corps, which is actually where we're training up young people to help other young people use Prosocial to cooperate to work on groups that they care about. Perhaps groups that are associated with climate change or social justice or other local issues that are key to them. I did also want to tell you about a few of the other applications of Prosocial that are currently being used, so you can get a bit of a sense of the generality of it. It's not just within the educational context. It has been used in universities, but it's also being used in communities in different ways. So this woman here sitting on the ground is the CEO of an organisation called Hivi Sasa in Kenya, which is a citizen journalism initiative. Chloe Sperry is her name. Hivi Sasa has 1,700 citizen journalists writing stories for it right across the country and then submitting that for the good of all in Kenya by sharing information. They applied Prosocial in a few different ways. First of all, they sent a number of their core staff within the backbone organisation that sustains this network. They sent those staff along to a Prosocial course so that they could develop the skills to help facilitate a downsizing in staff from 34 people to 19 in a way that was equitable, fair, and where they managed potential conflicts more effectively. They did that, it worked really well, and then they applied it to their citizen journalism network. So amongst their 1,700 journalists, they do have some that sometimes don't act for the good of the group. For example, they might make up a story and publish it as if it was real, which obviously undermines trust in the entire network. So the group as a whole, using Prosocial, then came up with a set of sanctions and responses that they wanted to make when someone cooked a story. And they've implemented that, and it made handling of these cookers much more effective. They've also used the idea of the tragedy of the commons to talk about corruption and political and public institutions, and how if we understand those public institutions as a commons, how might we use Prosocial to help improve those public institutions? Some other work I'd like to talk to you about is Professor Robert Stiles' work in the South Pacific and across Asia, working with government departments to help improve strategic initiatives at the national and international level. One characteristic feature of his work is that he spends a lot of time helping groups to envision possible futures and to develop a sense of purpose in the prospect of different possible futures that might unfold. Another really exciting project is being conducted by the Terran Collective. Terran Collective are building a regenerative social media platform, an alternative to Facebook, that isn't about extraction and advertising and making as much money as possible, but is more about building community, sharing, and embodying the Prosocial principles. In their work, they're using Prosocial to help form teams that build user guidelines informed by the Prosocial principles, for example. And lastly, I'd like to talk to you about Dr. Jim Lemon and his team in the National Health Service that are implementing Prosocial. They started working with chronically ill children and the teams that form around chronically ill children. So a chronically ill child might have a psychologist, a physiotherapist, a rheumatologist perhaps, various professionals that are gathered together, but then they've also got their family as well as part of their team, and of course themselves. So how do we get all of those people working well together in a situation where there isn't really formal hierarchies or power? And what Jim discovered was that he could use the matrix tool to help people discover shared identity and purpose. What is our purpose? Looking after this child, what's the child's purpose? Is it about cure, or is it about preserving quality of life, for instance? And how will we make decisions together? How will we do that equitably? How will we resolve conflicts? The Prosocial process has been really useful in that process. So if you'd like to learn more about Prosocial and particularly its application in schools, please do get in touch with me at paul.atkins@prosocialworld. Visit our website, www.prosocial.world. Visit the Prosocial Schools website that I just had up there. And if you're interested, you can take a look at one or more of these books. One is Prosocial, our book, written first author me. Stephen Hayes's book on psychological flexibility. And more recently, Tony Biglin's book, which sets all of this work in a much bigger context of how we can really change the narrative from self-interest to collective interest in our society. And together we can create the more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from you. Bye for now.